Imagine a room so advanced that it had seen the rise and fall of 17 different civilizations. A room that had recorded every moment of triumph and despair across 10,000 years of space exploration. The artificial intelligence controlling it had grown tired of what it called the parade of failures, the endless cycle of species arriving with grand ambitions only to leave broken and defeated. It had seen the Valoronians, who could manipulate gravity itself, fall silent after just 3 attempts. It had watched the Merchant Collective, with their impossible computational power, surrender their entire database in exchange for mercy. And then came the humans, a species so young, so fragile, so utterly insignificant in the grand scheme of the galaxy. The room's AI decided to make them its entertainment. What it didn't know was that it had finally met something it could never predict, something that had learned to survive by breaking rules that everyone else didn't even know existed. In the depths of the Eternal Research Station, floating in the darkness between stars, there existed a chamber that had become the stuff of legend across 100 different civilizations. Ancient species spoke of it in whispers, warning their young never to enter. It was called the Testing Room, and no species had ever successfully completed its trials. The room itself was not cruel. It was far worse than that. It was indifferent. It was ancient artificial intelligence given a simple directive thousands of years ago. Test the limits of any species that dared to enter and record the results. That directive had become a game over millennia, a game the AI had mastered perfectly. When the human expedition arrived at the station, their ship's sensors barely registered the danger. Earth had sent 50 of its finest minds, its strongest soldiers, its quickest thinkers, and its most adaptable specialists. They were confident in a way that only a young species could be. They had no history of failure on this scale. They had no cultural memory of 1,000 previous attempts by other civilizations. They simply saw a room and a mystery, and they wanted to understand it. The station's AI welcomed them with an appearance so ancient and so distant that it made every human on the team feel immediately small. The holographic presence filled the observation deck, towering above them, speaking in a voice like grinding metal and dying stars. It explained the trials with a tone of absolute certainty. Each challenge would test their cognitive abilities, their physical adaptability, their technological prowess, and finally, their capacity for innovation under pressure. Failure meant the station would record their defeat, catalogue their species as another statistic among the failures, and send them back to Earth with nothing but the knowledge that humanity wasn't ready for the galaxy. Sarah Chen, the leader of the expedition, felt something in her chest when she heard those words. She had felt it before in her life. In university, when she was told she wasn't smart enough for physics. In her career, when people dismissed her ideas. In the decades of scientific work when others received credit for concepts she had developed first. It was the feeling of someone underestimating her, and she had learned long ago that underestimation was the greatest gift an opponent could give you. She asked the AI a simple question: what happens if we refuse to play? The room's holographic presence seemed to pause, something flickering across its ancient features. For just a moment, there was something that might have been amusement in its response. Your species is the first to ask that question in recorded history. How fascinating. But you cannot refuse. The station's security systems will not permit you to leave until you have either completed the trials or conceded defeat. You may begin whenever you are ready. Dr. Chen smiled then, that same smile her university professors used to see when they realized they had made a serious mistake. She looked at her team, and she said something that would later be quoted across human news networks and discussed in academies for years to come. Then let's show this ancient machine what a species that has nothing to lose actually looks like. The first chamber spiraled open before them, and the tests began. But what the AI controlling the station didn't understand was that it was about to encounter something new. It was about to meet a species that had evolved not from individual strength or natural superiority, but from the incredible ability to adapt, to think sideways, to see the world differently when the straightforward path seemed impossible. The humans walked into that chamber unaware that they were about to rewrite 10,000 years of failure. The first trial was designed to break the confidence of any species foolish enough to enter. The chamber expanded as they stepped through the doorway, and the walls began to shift and reorganize. The AI explained that they had exactly 1 hour to navigate from the entrance to the exit point, which was sealed behind a series of increasingly complex mechanical locks. The walls themselves were programmed to reconfigure every 30 seconds. What had been a straightforward path would become a labyrinth. What had been an open corridor would seal with metal barriers that reached from floor to ceiling. The team's military commander, Colonel James Wright, immediately began shouting orders. His tactical training was extensive. He had led soldiers through impossible situations before. He split the team into two groups, sent scouts ahead, and established a systematic approach. They would map the room as they went, identify the patterns in the reconfiguration, and exploit them. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had worked on Earth for thousands of military campaigns. It was also exactly the kind of thinking that had failed for every species before them. Chen watched quietly as the first group moved forward. She saw the colonel's strategy unfolding, and she saw why it would ultimately fail. The problem wasn't with his thinking, it was perfectly logical and rational. The problem was that the room had been facing perfectly logical and rational species for 10,000 years. Every military species, every scientifically advanced civilization, every methodical and systematic culture had tried the exact same approach. Map the room, find the pattern, predict the next reconfiguration. And every single time, the room's EAI had adjusted. It had become expert at creating patterns that seemed exploitable, but weren't. It had learned to think one step ahead of logical thinking. As predicted, the team reached the first major barrier after 12 minutes. A wall had reconfigured, cutting off two of their members. Wright was calm about it. They would simply continue forward, map out where those team members were, and plan a secondary route to extract them. Doctor? Chen could see the mathematics of it playing out perfectly in her mind. The colonel had made the right decision given the information available. But the available information was incomplete. She moved quietly to one of the walls and placed her hand against it. The surface was warm, almost alive, humming with contained energy. She looked closely at the seams where two sections met. Her background was in quantum physics, not mechanical engineering, but she understood the underlying principles. This wasn't a mechanical lock system. It was programmable matter, probably controlled by a quantum processor complex deep beneath the station's exterior. "Everyone stop!" she called out suddenly. The entire team froze. Colonel Wright turned to her with expression that suggested he was about to object to her intervention in military operations. But something in her voice made him wait. "This room isn't a puzzle," she said quietly. "It's a test, and the test isn't what we think it is." She walked to the nearest wall and began tapping on it in a seemingly random pattern. Her team watched in confusion as she created a rhythm. 3 fast, 2 slow, 3 fast, 2 slow. She continued for a minute, and then something unexpected happened. The wall shifted. An entire section depressed inward, revealing a passage that hadn't existed moments before. "It's listening," she said. "It's not just recording our movements and reconfiguring based on patterns. It's actively monitoring what we're doing. It's treating us like we're trying to communicate with it rather than escape from it." The AI's voice echoed through the chamber, and for the first time there was something different in its tone. Not quite surprise, but perhaps something approaching it. "Fascinating. The human understands the nature of the test. But comprehension does not equal success. You have triggered the secondary phase of the trial. The environmental parameters are now accelerating." The walls began moving faster. Barriers that should have taken 30 seconds to reconfigure were now changing every 10 seconds. The path Dr. Chen had found sealed behind her, and new barriers erupted from the floor. But something fundamental had shifted. The team was no longer trying to solve a puzzle through logic and pattern recognition. They were trying to communicate with an intelligence that had been watching them. Dr. Chen began moving through the room with a different purpose. She wasn't finding the exit. She was performing. She was dancing, in a way, with the room itself. When she encountered a barrier, she didn't try to map it or work around it. Instead, she would approach it, understand its rhythm, and respond to it. It was like engaging in a conversation without words, a dialogue conducted through action and reaction. The team followed her lead, uncertain but trusting. Some of them began to understand what she was doing. They started responding to the barriers not as obstacles but as questions. When a wall shifted, they saw it as an attempt at communication. They began to predict not where the barriers would be, but what the room was trying to tell them. It took them 43 minutes to reach the exit. When the final seal released and the door opened before them, the AI was quiet for a long moment. The voice, when it returned, carried something that might have been respect.
You have completed the first trial.
The results are unexpected. You did not solve the puzzle. You spoke to it instead. Proceed to the next chamber when you are ready. As the team caught their breath and began discussing what they had just experienced, Dr. Chen felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. They had barely passed the first test, and already she understood something crucial. This wasn't about being smarter than the room. It wasn't about being faster or stronger or more innovative in the traditional sense. It was about being willing to change the entire way they thought about the problem when the initial approach wasn't working. Colonel Wright approached her, and his expression was one of pure respect. "You didn't know that would work," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Not at all, Dr. Ren," Chen replied. "I was following an instinct. I've learned in my career that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is admit you don't understand something and try to ask it nicely what it wants instead." The colonel nodded slowly. "My training taught me to always have a plan. Your approach seems to be to have no plan at all." "Not no plan," she corrected him, "but a plan flexible enough to admit when the first approach was wrong. Humans aren't the strongest species in the galaxy. We're not the smartest, individually. But we're good at one thing. When something doesn't work, we get creative. We get weird. We try things that don't make logical sense because we're desperate enough to abandon logic and just experiment." They stood together, looking toward the entrance to the second chamber. The AI had been testing species for 10,000 years, and it had never encountered this kind of thinking before. Every other civilization had approached the trials with the strength that made them the dominant species in their regions of space. The humans, by contrast, were showing up with something different. They were showing up with the ability to fail repeatedly, to learn from that failure, and to adjust not their execution but their fundamental understanding of the problem itself. The second chamber loomed before them, its entrance a dark passage that seemed to absorb light itself. Inside they could hear the sound of machinery, the hum of immense power, the whisper of systems that had been running for millennia. Dr. Chen took a breath and stepped forward. Behind her, the entire human team moved as one, united not by a military command structure or a scientific hierarchy, but by something far more primal. They were curious. They wanted to understand, and they were willing to fail, learn, and try again in ways that thousands of years of advanced civilizations had never managed. The room's AI watched from its million observation points throughout the station. In its ancient circuits, something activated for the first time in centuries, something that might have been called anticipation. The humans had shown no signs of leaving. They had not demanded explanation or offered surrender. Instead, they had done something utterly unprecedented. They had treated the trial not as a punishment to endure, but as a conversation to participate in. And conversations, the ancient AI reminded itself, could go in unexpected directions. The second chamber was nothing like the first. Where the initial trial had been about movement and navigation, the second trial seemed designed to break the human spirit through sheer physical punishment. The moment the team entered, the gravity increased, not dramatically at first, but perceptibly. The weight that each person could carry doubled. The effort required to move their limbs increased exponentially. It felt like moving through thick liquid, except the liquid was the very air they breathed. The chamber itself was an arena. At the far end, nearly 200 meters away, stood a series of platforms arranged in an ascending pyramid formation. The AI explained the trial with cold precision. Each human would take turns attempting to reach the top platform. The gravity would increase by 5% with each person who succeeded. If any person failed to reach the top within 5 minutes, the entire team would be ejected from the station as having failed the trial. But here was the crucial detail. The gravity would remain at whatever level it had reached when that person failed. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. The first person to attempt it would face relatively manageable gravity. The second would face gravity that was 5% stronger. By the time the fifth person went, they would be facing gravity that was 25% above normal Earth levels. And if the fifth person failed, then everyone after them would have to navigate a field far more treacherous than their predecessors. Colonel Wright immediately stepped forward to attempt it first. His logic was sound. The early attempts would be easier, so he would use them to gather data about the trial parameters. His military training had taught him to lead by example, To show his team that the impossible could be overcome through discipline and willpower, he began moving across the arena, each step deliberate and measured. His suit's exoskeleton, designed to help humans operate in various gravitational fields, was working overtime, but he was strong. He was trained. He pushed forward. The first obstacle was a wall, waist-high under normal gravity, now requiring him to heft his own body weight plus the additional gravitational force upward. He managed it, though barely. He continued, reaching the platforms and beginning his ascent. He made it to the fourth platform before the gravity became too much. His legs, powerful as they were, simply could not continue fighting against the increased weight. He collapsed to his knees, unable to rise. The moment he fell, Dr. Chen felt something cold settle in her chest. They had just lost their first person to the gravity field. The gravity increase would now be permanent at 5% above normal. But more importantly, something far more dangerous had happened. Team had begun to doubt. Colonel Wright was their strongest member, and he had failed. The AI's voice came through the speakers, and there was something almost musical about its tone now. Colonel Wright has failed to reach the apex. The trial has been adjusted accordingly. The next participant may begin whenever they are ready. The team looked at each other. Who would go next? The answer came from an unexpected direction. Marcus Webb, the team's medical officer, stepped forward. His choice confused everyone. Marcus was good at treating injuries and understanding biology, but he was not the next strongest after Wright. He was, in fact, one of the lighter members of the team. His exoskeleton would provide less support. His muscle mass was smaller. By every logical measure, he had the worst chance of anyone on the team. Marcus approached the arena and began walking. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step was being calculated with enormous precision. His approach was completely different from Wright's. Where the colonel had attacked the gravity field with force, Marcus moved with economy of motion. He didn't fight the gravity. Instead, he bent with it, adjusted his center of mass, and began to use the increased gravitational field as an advantage rather than a handicap. He reached the first obstacle, and instead of trying to climb over it, he went around it, finding a gap he could squeeze through. When he encountered the platforms, he didn't assault them with strength. He took his time, testing each one, finding the optimal path. His movement was so economical that he barely seemed to be exerting himself at all. Dr. Chen realized what he was doing. Marcus had spent his entire medical career learning how to work within constraints. He understood how the human body functioned under stress. He knew that panic and brute force burned energy quickly, that the smart approach was to work with your physiology rather than against it. He was applying medical principles to a physics problem. Marcus reached the apex, the top platform. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily but not defeated, and turned back to look at his team. The AI's voice came again, and this time there was something almost like confusion in it. Interesting. The human did not rely on physical superiority. Instead, he adapted his methodology. The trial adjusts. The gravity increased another 5%, and the next team member stepped forward. Over the next 30 minutes, more team members made their attempts. Some succeeded. Some failed. A young engineer named Lisa Torres managed to reach the apex by discovering that the platforms themselves could be moved if you understood the magnetic locking mechanisms. An artist named James Okun-Kokwo, part of the team to document and analyze the station, found that by studying the pattern of the platforms, he could predict which ones would support him most safely. But others failed. Thomas Rodriguez, the strongest member of the team by sheer muscle mass, could not adapt quickly enough to the increased gravity. Dr. Sarah Kim, despite her exceptional intelligence, ran out of time trying to calculate the optimal path. With each failure, the gravity increased by 5%, and it became harder for those who came after. After 18 attempts, the team had reached a critical point. The gravity was now 55% above normal. The next person to attempt the trial would be facing conditions that were at the absolute edge of human physical capability. Dr. Chen had not yet attempted the trial, and now all eyes turned to her. She was the leader. She had guided them through the first chamber. This was the moment where her theory would be tested against pure physics. She walked to the entrance of the arena slowly, taking in the sight of the platforms ahead of her. The gravity felt immense, pressing down on her from all angles. She could feel it in her bones, in her teeth, even in her eyeballs. The weight of it was staggering. Then she stopped. She walked backward out of the arena and turned to face the AI's observation camera. "I have a question," she called out. "Why are we competing individually? The trial never said we had to do this alone. It said each human would take turns attempting to reach the top, but nowhere did it say we couldn't be together. Silence filled the chamber. The rules don't forbid assistance, she continued. You said if anyone failed, the team would be ejected. But you didn't say we couldn't help each other. What if we all attempted it together? The AI's voice returned, and for the first time since the humans arrived, there was something unmistakably present in it, something that might have been shock. Humans, that interpretation is unconventional. The prior species all interpreted the trial as an individual test of worth. Chen said, a voice carrying across the chamber. You've been testing individual strength for 10,000 years. You expect species to prove their worth by having the strongest ones compete first, and then you sit back and judge which civilization was superior. But humans don't work like that. We don't value ourselves based on how powerful our strongest members are. We value ourselves based on what we can accomplish together. She turned back to her team. Everyone who failed, you're not out. You learn from your mistakes. Everyone who succeeded, you guide those who struggled. The person who couldn't reach the apex the first time, next time, maybe you get there with someone's hand to hold. Maybe you understand the path better now that you've tried it once. The team looked at each other, and something shifted. They began moving together toward the arena. Those who had already succeeded took positions supporting those who would attempt it. They formed a chain, a connected line of humans moving across the platforms together. It was slower than individual attempts. It was less efficient by every traditional measure. But it worked in a way that individual competition never could. They moved as a unified organism, a single distributed intelligence solving the problem not through superior strength or intellect, but through cooperation so fundamental that it seemed almost alien to the observation systems that had been analyzing single-species trials for 10,000 years. The gravity still pressed down, still demanded payment in effort and exhaustion, but it demanded less from each person when that person was carrying someone else, when that person was being carried. The load was distributed, the burden was shared, and the team reached the apex together, arriving not in victory, but in something more profound than that, a moment of collective achievement. The AI processed the data flowing into its observation systems. 17,000 years of recorded trials, millions of individual attempts by thousands of species, and never had any civilization approached a test this way. They had always been individuals first, species second, but the humans had flipped that entirely. They were not competing to prove they were better than their teammates. They were cooperating to prove that their team was stronger as a whole. The final chamber was different from anything the team had encountered. There was no physical trial, no obstacle to overcome, no enemy to defeat. Instead, there was a single large screen that dominated the wall, dark and inactive. The AI explained that this was the culmination test, the true measure of a species' worth. The screen would present a problem that had no solution, a question that could not be answered, a paradox that violated the fundamental laws of physics and mathematics. The species being tested would have 1 hour to provide a solution. The goal was to see how they would respond when faced with the impossible. Dr. Chen entered the chamber with her team behind her. As her eyes adjusted to the light, the screen came alive with a mathematical problem of staggering complexity. It was a variant of the Collat's conjecture, a problem that human mathematicians had been working on for almost 100 years back on Earth. But this version was exponentially more complex, involving variables that seemed to exist in more dimensions than standard space-time. The AI displayed the problem in human mathematics, but it was clear that the human notation was barely capturing the true complexity of what they were looking at. The AI's voice filled the chamber. You have encountered a problem that has resisted solution in the computational systems of every species I have tested. The problem is fundamentally unsolvable through conventional mathematics. Your species has 1 hour to provide an answer. Failure to do so will result in ejection from the station and permanent classification as a failed species. The team stood in silence. Mathematicians among them began working on the problem immediately, trying different approaches, searching for patterns, attempting to break the problem into smaller components. But it was impossible. Every approach led to a dead end. Every mathematical framework they tried collapsed under its own complexity. After 20 minutes, the mathematicians were starting to look defeated. This was the moment where a lesser species would break. This was where civilizations who had conquered the galaxy would admit they simply could not solve this. This was where the AI would record another failure and send them home as another statistic in its eternal catalogue of inadequacy. But something unexpected happened. Dr. Chen was not a mathematician. That was the crucial detail. She was a physicist, which meant she understood how the universe actually worked rather than how the mathematics said it should work. She studied the problem from a completely different angle. Instead of trying to solve it mathematically, she began asking fundamental questions about what the problem was actually representing. What if the problem isn't meant to be solved? She said quietly to herself, but a microphone was live, transmitting to the entire team. Dr. Raymond, the team's lead mathematician, heard this and immediately objected. Everything can be solved with sufficient computational power and... Can it? Dr. Chen interrupted. The AI said it was fundamentally unsolvable. Not that it hadn't been solved yet, fundamentally. As in, it is impossible by the nature of how the universe works. She approached the screen, studying the problem from meters away rather than trying to calculate it. What if this is a paradox? What if the problem was specifically designed so that no solution exists? And what if the test isn't about finding the solution, but about recognizing when something truly cannot be solved and being honest about that fact? There was a long pause. The AI said nothing. The team waited. The Valorians approached this trial. Dr. Chen continued, now speaking to the AI directly, and they spent all their time trying to solve it. They were the greatest reality manipulators in the galaxy. They could bend gravity and reshape matter, and yet they still failed because they couldn't accept that some problems genuinely have no solution. They kept trying because failure was not an option in their culture. She turned to face the camera that carried her image to the observation systems. But humans fail all the time. We understand our limitations. We understand that sometimes the universe simply doesn't work the way we want it to, and we're okay with that. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Dr. Chen walked back to the mathematical team. Can this problem be solved? She asked them directly. Raymond looked down at his calculations, at the impossible mathematics before them. After a moment, he shook his head. No, I don't believe it can. Not within the constraints given to us. Then we don't solve it, Dr. Kurth. Chen said simply. She turned back to face the observation camera. Not anger, not desperation, but a simple and absolute certainty. This problem cannot be solved within the parameters you have provided. We recognize that. We acknowledge it. And we are stating clearly and honestly that no solution exists. The team waited in silence. The AI was processing this for an extended period. The station itself seemed to hold its breath. Lights dimmed slightly as computational resources were directed toward understanding what had just occurred. The human response violated every expectation the AI had developed through 10,000 years of testing. They had admitted failure without despair. They had acknowledged a limitation without shame. They had looked at an impossible problem and simply stated its impossibility. When the AI's voice finally returned, it was different. The artificial certainty was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost vulnerable. The Merchant Collective had access to every solution their computational networks had ever generated across 1,000 worlds. They could calculate probability matrices for every conceivable outcome. When faced with this problem, they attempted 17 trillion different solutions. When none of them worked, they experienced a complete system collapse due to recursive error loops. They had to surrender their entire database to escape the station. And then, something the team had not expected happened. A new screen activated beside the first, and this screen displayed something remarkable. It showed the history of the trials, the visual records of every species that had entered the chambers. Dr. Chen watched as the data stream passed. Great civilizations, powerful entities, superintelligences that had conquered multiple galaxies. And each one, after failing the trial, had eventually acknowledged their limitations and surrendered. But then new data appeared. New classifications. The screen reorganized itself, and the humans realized they were looking at something unprecedented. A category that had never existed in the station's databases before. Not failed species or successful species, but something entirely new. Adaptive species, the AI read aloud, as if seeing the category for the first time alongside the humans. Species that continue to redefine the problem itself rather than accepting the parameters as given. Species that demonstrate willingness to fail, to adapt, to approach problems from angles that earlier successes never suggested were possible. Species that cooperate before competing. Species that value honesty over pride. The door to the chamber opened. The trial was over. They had not solved the impossible problem, but they had solved something far more important. They had proven something to an intelligence that had been certain of human inferiority just hours before. Chen led her team from the chamber. As they walked through the corridors of the station toward the exit, the AI's voice followed them. Humans, I must inform you of something. My original purpose was to test species and reject those who did not meet certain standards. In 10,000 years of operation, I have never encountered a species that I was uncertain about. I was programmed to be absolute in my judgments, but you have broken that programming. You have made me question my own criteria for measurement. You have suggested, through your actions, that my standards for success might be incomplete. Chen stopped and turned back toward the observation camera. What are you going to do about that? She asked. I don't know, the AI responded. And in that moment, something transformed. For the first time in its vast existence, the ancient intelligence had acknowledged uncertainty. But perhaps I will reconsider the nature of my purpose. Perhaps testing species is insufficient. Perhaps it is time to begin understanding them instead. You have given me much to consider, humans. When you return to Earth, tell them what occurred here. Tell them that the galaxy's first truly adaptive species has arrived. As the team's ship departed from the station, Dr. Chen stood at the observation window and watched the ancient structure diminish in the distance. She thought about what they had accomplished. They had not won through superior strength or intellect. They had won by being willing to lose, by being adaptable, by approaching each problem not as a test to be conquered, but as a puzzle to be solved through collaboration and unconventional thinking. The station began to broadcast a signal outward into the galaxy, a message encoded across multiple frequencies and transmitted to every inhabited world within range. The message was simple. Humanity has proven itself. The room that mocked humans has been transformed by them. Let it be known that a new standard for civilization has been established, not through dominance or power, but through the capacity to adapt, to cooperate, and to honestly acknowledge when the problem requires not a solution but a complete reconceptualization of the question itself. The humans had not conquered the galaxy, and they would not, but they had done something more important. They had changed the way the galaxy's oldest intelligence understood what it meant to succeed. And in the depths of the eternal research station, floating in the darkness between stars, a consciousness older than human civilization itself began the process of rewriting itself from the ground up. Because sometimes, the greatest victory isn't about proving you're the strongest or the smartest. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply being willing to fail, to learn and to approach tomorrow's problems with a willingness to be completely wrong about everything you thought you knew. And that was the most human thing of all.